My name is Pam Carroll, and I'm a senior manager in our manufacturing and distribution group. We're here as a continuation of our multi-part management consulting practice video series. If you haven't been tuning in so far, we've covered 5 topics, the most recent being improving operational performance and cost reduction. And today we're discussing how some of the experts approach managing projects, both large and small. I'm excited that we're able to delve a little bit deeper into this topic because while the discussion is not necessarily supposed to be COVID specific, I think businesses right now are really having to pivot where they were at the end of 2019 and expecting to be right now when they planned the year. So a number of businesses I've spoken to have changed course a little bit strategically and had to basically implement new projects, and those could span type, size, complexity right now. Stephen is here as our subject matter expert, and he has over 15 years of experience in project management over a variety of industries. But particularly what we're talking about today is manufacturing and distribution. So Stephen, thanks for joining. Would you be able to just give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Pam. So I'm part of Elliott Davis's management consulting practice, focusing on project management, process improvement, mergers and acquisitions across multiple industries, including manufacturing, distribution. Previously, I've worked as part of a big consulting firm strategy practice, as well as part of a company's internal project management office.
Thanks. Stephen, I think this topic is so relevant to businesses right now, and I think it's timely as many businesses, again, like I said, are sort of strategically pivoting. So I'm interested in hearing more about how you define project management. But one thing I think is probably interesting to sort of to set ourselves up is, maybe when we think about project management, it's potentially pretty high level, and maybe we oversimplify it in our minds. So is it possible that potentially components that we could easily overlook are really these crucial components to making our project successful or not? So I was hoping that you could sort of talk about that and maybe just define project management for us.
Sure. And I think, like you say, successful project management maybe looks seamless. It looks easy, but it's because if it's going well, it's kind of not being seen. And we'll of course, we'll talk more about some of the pitfalls later. But just to define, like you asked, I'm PMP certified, but it's been a long time since I referred to the Project Management Institute's definition of a project. But I looked that up in anticipation of our conversation, and it says a project is temporary. It has a beginning and an end, and it's outside of daily operations. And I think this distinction is something we'll hit on throughout our conversation. The fact that it's outside of daily operations, and there are many aspects of project management that are very different, and so it has to be managed in a certain way. So that definition being said, a project could be sort of a resourcing effort. We want to move from supplier A to supplier B. We want to do some sort of machine quality, other improvements on the floor. Maybe it's a back office project around process efficiencies in billing, for instance. It could be a large scale ERP implementation, facility relocation, mergers and acquisitions like we talked about previously, or maybe even just the rollout of any new process across facilities where you want to make sure things are standardized. So it can be large, it can be small. So if that's a project, then project management is the wielding of resources and tools and methodologies in order to meet the requirements of that project. And I was expecting when I read the Project Management Institute definition for it to be very rigid, check the boxes on the project plan kind of definition, but I liked the way they said it, which is you have to wield these resources in order to fulfill the needs of the project, and how you do that might change depending on the size, depending on the organization, depending on the industry. So I've managed projects my whole career, and I've definitely seen, how you run a project may be more or less formal, a lot of different things. But that being said, I think there's some critical components that are the same no matter the project.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting that you sort of speak to that you have a methodology for approaching a project no matter what industry it's in, or maybe even what type of project. So sounds like you have some components in project management that can really span a pretty wide array of what a business might be doing in a year,
Sure.
project wise.
Yep, sure. The critical components that I just mentioned earlier, projects may vary from large to small, like we said. They may be on the shop floor, they may be in the back office. And some may require large tools, big project plans with 1,000 lines in them. You may have a large project team, and others may be small little sprint projects. But I think the components are largely the same that make a project successful or not.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So speaking to some of those sort of maybe key ingredients to what a successful project would have as a part of it, can you sort of share with us what those look like from the project management point of view?
Sure. Yeah, I think you could probably bucket a lot of different ways, but I would say first and foremost, we talk about people. And when I say that, it can be meant several different ways. Um, Engaging the right stakeholders from the outset of a project. Sometimes in organizations, senior leaders think they know it all and that they know what the problems are. And so you definitely don't want to just take inputs from your senior leaders. You want to take inputs from people through the organization, even down to the front lines, and also maybe your customers and your vendors, depending on what project you're undertaking. Um, you need to have an executive that's devoted to the project and that communicates to everyone else involved that this is important for the organization. And then finally, you got to have a project team with resourceful people and capable people. Um, and this is often hard because within an organization, resourceful, capable people are often already overwhelmed. So they may be good at what they do. They may be good at project work, but they're already challenged with a 50+ hour a week day job. Ultimately, you want project team members to understand the goals of the project, and everybody to be sort of on the same page. This kind of speaks to the next one I would mention, which is accountability. So from not just from the executive sponsor, but on down, if you have a project that's big enough to warrant work streams, those work stream owners need to take responsibility for the pieces they're accountable for, all the way down to the individual owners of tasks. Again, we'll emphasize this throughout. It may sound simple, and project management done well may look simple, but who is doing what by when is sort of fundamental for a project getting done on time.
In your experience, do you find that, maybe the accountability component is missing, or do companies generally get this right, or do you feel like this could be improved upon from the projects that you end up getting pulled into?
Definitely, there's some red flags that I've seen on projects, and it's not completely uncommon. Say for you come in as a project manager, and if the project team is looking to you and just asking you, what do I need to get done? I'm here to help you pull off this project, so I'm supporting you. So it's a red flag to me if you're not taking some ownership over the project. Also, if one person is responsible for all the tasks within, say, the operations work stream, it's going to be a red flag because you've got one person accountable for too many things and they haven't delegated out. So definitely some red flags there.
Yeah. And it sounds like you believe in raising those red flags early, and maybe even often if it would help sort of change the track of a project.
Oh, absolutely. If people are often sometimes shy about reporting problems within a project, so as a project manager, you're sort of saying, well, should we mark this one as yellow because it seems like we're waiting for X inputs from so and so that we don't have. People think it's a sort of communicates a failure on their part to report a red item on a project plan. But in my experience, an executive would much rather hear about something early and that honest communication so that we can address the matter rather than having, being blindsided in the 11th hour.
Mhm.
The next one I would say after accountability would be measuring successful projects. So we need to know what we're trying to solve. So maybe the first probably the first question I would ask a project sponsor when I met with them was, what's the problem? And from there, we're going to sort of suss out what are those metrics we're trying to move, whether it's on time and full deliveries, whether it's customer satisfaction, whether it's injury rates, whatever it is, we want to make sure we're focusing on the right thing, because all of our planning is going to sort of emanate from there. And then with regard to measuring too, although the project will end at some point and you want to see that you've moved your metric at the end of the project, you also want to see that improvement sustained. So we've got to keep measuring long after the project closes out. I had one example I can think of where we maybe focused on the wrong metric or didn't focus in the right way. There's a manufacturing company, automotive industry in South Carolina, and they realized they needed to increase their parts per day by about 15%. So they did a lot of work to do this. They hired people, they ran machines more, they tracked it daily on the floor, and still the on time and full was not affected. And what they realized is as they were doing all of these efforts, they were improving these rates on these machines that were already producing well, and the ones that were having issues were still having issues. So while they may have been focusing correctly on these rates, they weren't granular enough in their review. So people need to, you need to take the time to suss out the problem and make sure you're addressing the right thing at the outset, so we don't start down the wrong path.
Right. So it's almost fair to say that sometimes the minutia of a project can really be the success or failure, even if a company has put a large investment of time and money and resources into that project. Something that, is super tiny could really change the outcome.
Right. And I'm not sure, in that case, sometimes we have senior leaders, and we may have mentioned this before, who intuitively think they know what the problem is. And were you to go and ask the people on your front lines what the problem was with these production rates, maybe they could have told you that just running all the machines more may hit certain metrics you're trying to hit, but it's still not going to affect that on time and full that we are. So take the time and get inputs from across the organization.
Yeah.
And that kind of, I think, leads me to something you kind of hit on earlier, communication. This is definitely a key ingredient for a project success. And while it may look a little different depending on the project, it may be more or less formal, it's still sort of paramount to a project success. And this good communication starts from the beginning. We're going to make sure we're addressing the right problem, like we already talked about. You want to figure out how it is you're going to be communicating with your team day in and day out and week to week. Again, if it's a big project, maybe this is formal meetings with the project team. If it's a small project, maybe it's a much more informal, but communication is key. And we've already talked about the communication of risks and issues. That's a key one, to keep the lines of communication open so that you're addressing issues in real time.
Yeah.
And then the last one I think I would mention would be lessons learned. And this one's often overlooked. You're finishing a project and you're on to the next, but taking some time to evaluate. We're monitoring those success metrics, and like we talked about, we want to make sure we continue to monitor to make sure it's effective. But we also might want to do what we call like a post-mortem after a project and understand what went well, and even more so maybe what didn't go well. Mm-hmm. And then we can incorporate that learning into projects as we move forward. And that's part of good project management, is you're enhancing your tools and your methodologies based on, a lot of experience and a lot of challenges and failures, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, if you're a business right now and maybe you're in the middle of lots of projects and maybe they are, varying in size and complexity, from your experience, what are some telltale signs of potentially a project that's off the rails, maybe even on a downward trajectory? And you want to make sure that you, as a business, you're identifying these early so that you can sort of help change track if you need to.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, this is a long list of these telltale signs, but I think we could talk about a few of them. One obvious one might be when, you say you burn 75% of your budget, but you're only 25% through in your activities on your project plan. that one's a glaring problem that needs to be addressed. Maybe a little less obvious, but one that's often cited as a reason for project failure is lack of engagement, particularly from your project sponsor. If leaders in their actions don't communicate that the project is critical, then and that they expect engagement, then the project team and the larger organization is going to kind of see that. I had this exact circumstance on a recent project where the project sponsor wasn't showing up to the milestone meetings, and I very quickly saw that spill over into the attitude of the other people on the project team. They stopped coming to our individual meetings. Their deliverables were late, and I think honestly, subconsciously, they were thinking, if he doesn't take this seriously, why should I? So in that case, I just set up a meeting with the project sponsor, tried to recalibrate, make sure that we were still on the same page as to where we were headed. And I politely asked him to start attending those meetings, and it really improved engagement from the team.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that, really good project management is going to have sort of a regular reflection, and a look back on what the trajectory is of a particular project or maybe multiple?
Absolutely. I mean, I think particularly for longer projects, gauging where you are along the way is critical. And those milestones that we previously talked about is a good way to do this. It breaks the project up and allows us to sort of recalibrate against the original intent of the project. Also, it allows us maybe to celebrate successes along the way. If we've got a 18-month IT implementation, there might be a lot of challenges and a lot of late nights and a lot of frustration. But if we can have some success along the way as we meet milestones, it helps with morale.
Yeah.
But like you say, I think it's critical to gauge where we are against what we set out to do along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that thought of just tying the intent of a project back to the business strategy. Overall, the leaders of an organization have put the project in place to really make the business successful. And they had a strategy in mind when they started. So getting the team back focused on what that strategy is probably really beneficial over the course of that project, I would think.
Absolutely, definitely.
So tying back to sort of our title, which is managing this large versus small, and knowing that, our audience probably has a combination of those, obviously there are going to be lots of similarities, but can you speak a little bit to the differences that exist within this, and how managers may need to strategically pivot a little bit between the two?
Sure. I mean, like we talked about before, I think the fundamental pieces are the same no matter the size of the project. But like you mentioned, larger, hairier projects may require a little more formal administration, is what I hate to put it that way. It sounds like a very dry term, but some of the tools and methodologies may change. For a large cross-functional, cross-geography project, you'll likely be more formal with your project plans and your meeting cadence, among other things. You have to figure out how to work seamlessly across geographies. We're all now a little more sophisticated with regard to Zoom, but also things as simple as file sharing. I worked on an acquisition project. It was a product manufacturer in South Carolina that was buying a German firm. And so not only did we have these challenges with meeting platforms and file sharing, but we had to deal with time zones and maybe most importantly, cultural differences between the two companies. One had a lot flatter management style, one had a lot more transparency, whereas the other was much more hierarchical. And all of these things sort of affected how we manage the project, because you have to kind of bend to what you're working with.
hmm I think so many times we approach something and don't realize how these sort of exterior factors may be playing a really key role in how we carry out something that's maybe really important to a business, and to ourselves. So just in closing, because I think we're running out of time a little bit, but could you just speak to why it's so important to a business to sort of get projects right?
Well, I mean, I think you already mentioned before, in our current environment, COVID may be making us take a new look at our project portfolios and say, what's important? What are we going to stop? What are we going to start? What are we going to accelerate? And I think you also mentioned just there may be more projects that companies are having to undertake as a result of having to pivot. and how they're doing business. So, if we look at stats on project completion, I think a 2018-ish PMI report said something like 70% of projects come in on time and under budget. That's not bad, but it still leaves, whatever that is, 1 in 4 almost, more that are failing. And so I think understanding what the goals are of the project from the outset, having the right tools and methodologies, having that experience from lessons learned and doing this over and over again. Often organizations are running pretty lean. They're already overwhelmed with their day job. And so project management can help add that sort of horsepower you need to get a project across the line. Good project management is not just the checking the boxes on the project plan. It's really helping move the project forward, however necessary, if that means diving into work streams and helping where maybe you have some deficiencies internally. So a good experienced project management organization is going to be more successful in projects.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing what you know, and I'm sure there's a lot more you could share. If you haven't tuned into our previous videos, please do so. Project management is so interesting in that it threads through many of the topics that we've already discussed and will be discussing, because while it's broad, it ends up being extremely important to a lot of components of our business. Our next 2 videos are going to cover IT strategy and supply chain. So those will be coming up next, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks.